The engines of the Lisa Marie were already screaming, cutting through the humid silence of the Memphis night, but the plane wasn't moving. It sat there on the tarmac like a great silver beast, stranded under the floodlights, burning fuel for a journey that was never filed, for a destination that didn't exist. Inside the cockpit, Captain Jerry Kennedy's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the yoke, his eyes darting between the gauges and the closed door of the main cabin. He had flown Elvis Presley to sold-out arenas, to secret vacations, and to emergency hospital visits, but he had never felt the kind of cold, primal dread that was currently crawling up his spine. The radio crackled with the confused voice of the tower, asking for a flight plan that Kennedy couldn't give, because the instructions he had just received from the king of rock and roll defied every law of aviation and quite possibly reality itself. What was happening in the plush, velvet-lined cabin behind him wasn't just a celebrity breakdown. It was a haunting, a final collision between a man's shattered psyche and the ghosts he had spent 20 years trying to outrun. This wasn't just a flight request. It was a window into the final, terrifying collapse of the most famous man on Earth. A moment that history books ignored, but that would leave a pilot questioning his own sanity until the day he died. To understand why a seasoned pilot was trembling in an air-conditioned cockpit on that suffocating August night, you have to understand that the Elvis Presley sitting in the passenger cabin was not the sequined superstar the world saw on television. The man strapped into the oversized leather armchair was a ghost of himself, bloated, pale, and existing in a twilight state between the living and the dead. But the true horror for Captain Kennedy wasn't Elvis's physical condition. He had seen the king sick before. The horror was what Elvis had brought with him onto the plane, or rather, who he thought he had brought. Because when Elvis had shuffled up the stairs of the jet minutes earlier, he hadn't been talking to his bodyguards or his entourage. He had been having a whispered, tearful conversation with empty air, guiding an invisible companion into the seat next to him with a tenderness that was heartbreaking to watch. Kennedy had frozen, watching the king of rock and roll buckle the seatbelt around nothing, smoothing out the empty leather as if a fragile old woman was sitting there. And then Elvis had looked up, his eyes swimming with a mix of heavy medication and desperate clarity, and given the order that froze Kennedy's blood. He didn't want to go to Los Angeles or Denver or Vegas. He wanted to fly to the coordinates of a place that wasn't on any map, a place he claimed the invisible woman beside him, his long-dead mother, Gladys, had shown him in a dream. The events that led to this surreal standoff on the tarmac didn't start that night. They began days earlier, inside the jungle room and the darkened hallways of Graceland, where the atmosphere had turned from eccentric to oppressive. The psychology of deep, unresolved grief is a treacherous thing. When the human mind is subjected to decades of pressure, isolation, and chemical dependence, it doesn't just break, it fractures in a way that constructs a new reality to protect itself. Experts who analyze the final days of public figures often point to a phenomenon where the brain, sensing the end is near, begins to retreat into the past, seeking comfort in the memories of safety. For Elvis, safety was Gladys. His mother had been the anchor of his life, and her death in 1958 left a wound that never scabbed over. It bled for 20 years. In the week leading up to this final flight, that wound had torn open completely. Staff at Graceland whispered about seeing Elvis wandering the grounds at 3:00 a.m., not in his usual drug-fueled haze, but with a frantic, focused energy, looking for things that weren't there. He was searching for old family albums that had been put away years ago. He was demanding to know why certain rooms were locked, convinced that he could hear his mother calling him from the other side of the walls. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was the manifestation of a mind desperately trying to rewrite the ending of his own life. The educational explanation for this, what a psychiatrist might call a dissociative episode triggered by polypharmacy and sleep deprivation, fails to capture the emotional truth of what was happening. Elvis wasn't just hallucinating, he was trying to go home. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, surrounded by people who were on his payroll, isolated by his own fame. And in that crushing loneliness, his mind conjured the only person who had ever loved him simply for being Elvis, not for being the king. This psychological regression is what brought him to the airfield that night. He had convinced himself that if he could just get up in the air, if he could just reach a certain altitude or a specific point in the sky, the barrier between him and Gladys would dissolve completely. It was a child's logic operating with the resources of a millionaire. When Kennedy had received the call at his home earlier that evening, the voice on the other end hadn't sounded like the Elvis he knew. It was thin, reedy, and stripped of the charismatic baritone that had charmed millions. Elvis had simply said, "It's time, Captain, get the Lisa Marie ready, she's waiting." Kennedy assumed she meant the plane, or perhaps a new girlfriend. He arrived at the airfield expecting the usual routine, the limousines, the entourage, the hamburgers, the laughter. Instead, he found a scene that felt like a funeral procession. The runway lights reflected off the puddles from a recent summer storm, casting long, distorted shadows. There was no entourage, no laughter, just Elvis, stepping out of a car, clutching a small worn wooden box against his chest as if it contained the crown jewels. He was wearing a jumpsuit that had clearly been pulled from the back of a closet, wrinkled and stained, a stark contrast to his usual pristine appearance. As Elvis approached the stairs, Kennedy noticed the smell. It wasn't just the scent of the heavy colognes Elvis favored, but an underlying odor of sickness, a metallic, chemical smell that often clings to people whose bodies are failing. But it was the look in Elvis's eyes that stopped Kennedy in his tracks. It was a look of total, terrifying conviction. When he introduced Kennedy to the empty space beside him, saying, "Captain, you remember my mama, don't you?" He wasn't joking. He was pleading. He needed Kennedy to validate his reality. In that moment, the pilot was faced with an impossible choice: destroy the fragile delusion of a dying man, or play along with a madness that was becoming dangerous. Kennedy, a man of procedure and checklists, found himself nodding at the empty air, shaking a hand that wasn't there, simply to keep his boss calm. It was a moment of shared insanity that bonded them in a way no flight ever had. Once they were on board, the situation deteriorated with frightening speed. The cabin of the Lisa Marie was a marvel of 1970s luxury, a tube of suede, leather, and gold plating that served as Elvis's flying palace. But that night, it felt like a tomb. Kennedy retreated to the cockpit, going through the pre-flight checks, hoping that the roar of the engines would snap Elvis out of it. He started the APU, got the engines turning, and waited for Elvis to give a destination. That's when the coordinates came. Kennedy looked at the numbers Elvis had scribbled on a piece of hotel stationery. He punched them into his mental map and realized they led nowhere. It wasn't a city. It wasn't an airport. It was a point in the ionosphere, a blank spot in the sky. When Kennedy tried to explain this over the intercom, Elvis's voice came back, not angry, but pitifully confused. "No, Captain, look again. Mama says it's right there. It's where the light is." For 47 minutes, the plane sat there. 47 minutes is an eternity when jet engines are burning fuel and ground control is demanding answers. Kennedy sat in the cockpit, sweating through his uniform, listening to the sounds coming from the cabin. He didn't hear the usual sounds of bottles opening or the TV blaring. He heard a one-sided conversation that swung violently between joy and devastation. Elvis was confessing. He was apologizing for the pills, for the divorce, for the weight gain, for the loneliness. He was pouring his soul out to the empty seat, begging for forgiveness from the mother he felt he had failed by surviving her. It was the sound of a man settling his accounts with the universe. At one point, Kennedy swore he heard a second voice, a soft, humming melody like a lullaby. He told himself it was the wind whistling through the fuselage, or interference on the radio, or perhaps just his own exhausted mind playing tricks on him in the high-stress environment. But the sound was distinct enough to make the hair on his arms stand up. It was a gentle, soothing sound, the kind a mother makes to calm a frightened child. The tension broke, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The intercom clicked on one last time. "Take us up, Jerry," Elvis whispered. "Just take us up. We don't need to land. We just need to go up." It was a suicide note disguised as a flight instruction. Kennedy knew that if he released the brakes and pushed the throttles forward, there would be no coming back. He was weighing the moral weight of the request against his duty as a pilot when the scream tore through the plane. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of pure, unadulterated loss. It was the sound of a connection being severed. Kennedy threw off his headset and scrambled back into the cabin. He found Elvis slumped over the armrest of the leather recliner, the wooden box fallen from his hands and shattered on the floor. Photos, dozens of black and white snapshots of a young Gladys Presley, were scattered across the deep pile carpet like confetti. Elvis was gasping for air, his hand reaching out toward the empty seat, his fingers clutching at nothing but dust motes dancing in the cabin lights. "She's gone," he wheezed, looking at Kennedy with eyes that were suddenly terrifyingly lucid. "She couldn't wait, I wasn't fast enough." The delusion had broken, and the reality that rushed in to replace it was unbearable. The woman in black, the ghost, the hallucination, whatever it was, had vanished, leaving Elvis alone in a cold metal tube on a dark runway. The aftermath of that night was swift and silent. Kennedy called for the car to come back. They got Elvis off the plane, supporting his weight as he stumbled down the stairs, weeping not for himself, but for the mother he had lost a second time. The official story, the one that would be protected by NDAs and family loyalty, would be that Elvis had gone to the airport to check on the plane, or perhaps to retrieve something he had left on board. The truth of the hallucination, the invisible passenger, and the flight to nowhere was buried. It was too raw, too indicative of the total mental collapse that was occurring. It didn't fit the image of the king. But for Jerry Kennedy, the story didn't end when the car taillights faded into the darkness. In the years that followed, long after Elvis died on August 16th, just hours after this incident on the tarmac, Kennedy struggled to reconcile what he had seen. He was a rational man, a pilot trained in physics and mechanics. He knew that ghosts weren't real. He knew that grief could induce psychosis. He knew that the combination of uppers, downers, and opioids could create vivid waking dreams. And yet, he couldn't shake the physical sensation of that night. He couldn't forget the way the air in the cabin had felt charged, heavy with a static that wasn't electrical. He couldn't forget the smell of roses, a scent Gladys Presley was known to wear, that had lingered in the cabin even after Elvis was gone, overpowering the smell of jet fuel and sweat. This story serves as a grim, educational case study in what we now understand as terminal lucidity, or the end-of-life rally, albeit in a twisted, tragic form. Often patients near death will have a sudden burst of energy, a clarity or a specific vision of deceased loved ones coming to collect them. It is a well-documented medical phenomenon. Elvis's desperate drive to the airport, his energy to board the plane, his conviction that his mother was there. It all fits the pattern. His body was shutting down, and his brain was providing a narrative to make the transition easier. He wasn't losing his mind was trying to save his soul by offering him the one thing he wanted more than life itself, his mother. The tragedy of the last flight isn't that it never took off. The tragedy is that Elvis believed it was his only way out. He had the world at his feet, millions of dollars and legions of fans, but he felt so trapped that he believed he needed an airplane to escape the prison of his own life. The wooden box, which was later collected by members of the Memphis Mafia and returned to the house, contained not just photos but letters. Letters he had written to Gladys over the years, unsent, kept in a vault. He had brought them to read to her. He had planned a memorial service at 30,000 feet. When news of Elvis's death broke the next day, the world mourned the rock star. They played Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock. But Captain Kennedy sat in his home, staring at the wall, thinking about the frightened boy in the white jumpsuit who just wanted to show his mama the lights of Memphis one last time. He realized that he had been the sole witness to the true death of Elvis Presley. The man didn't die in the bathroom at Graceland. That was just his body giving up. The man, the spirit, the hope, had died on the tarmac inside the Lisa Marie. When the vision of his mother faded and he realized he was still alone, there is a lesson here about the destructive power of isolation. We often think of fame as a shield, but for Elvis it was a solvent that dissolved his connections to reality until only the past felt real. The pilot's bizarre final request wasn't an act of madness. It was an act of extreme, devastating logic. If the world you live in has become a nightmare, and the only person who ever made you feel safe is in heaven, then trying to fly there is the only rational thing to do. Today, the Lisa Marie sits as a museum piece across the street from Graceland. Tourists walk through that velvet cabin, peering behind velvet ropes, marveling at the gold seatbelt buckles and the expensive decor. They don't know that the fabric of those seats once absorbed the confessions of a dying king. They don't know that the air inside that fuselage once held the weight of a ghost. And they don't know that the pilot, for the rest of his career, would sometimes pause before takeoff, looking at the empty seat next to him, half expecting to see a woman in black, waiting to guide him home. The flight log for that night remains empty, a blank page in history. But in the mind of the man who sat in the cockpit, it was the longest, most significant flight Elvis Presley never took. It was the flight where the king finally tried to abdicate his throne in exchange for a mother's hug, only to find that gravity and the grave were the only things that were truly undeniable. The bizarre request wasn't about flying, it was about fleeing. And in the end, perhaps he finally got his clearance for takeoff, just not on the plane named after his daughter, but on the wings of the release that death finally granted him hours later.